She did not scream when they came for her, and that silence was the first lesson slavery taught African women in the Arab slave trade. Screaming wasted breath, crying invited blows. Resistance brought death that was rarely swift, so she learned to move when ordered, to lower her eyes, to swallow her name before someone else ripped it from her. She was one of millions of African women whose lives were consumed by a system that lasted more than 13 centuries, a system so vast and normalized that its cruelty disappeared behind tradition, religion, commerce, and time. The Arab slave trade did not announce itself with the industrial brutality of plantation fields or the visible chains of Atlantic ships. Its violence was quieter, more intimate, and often more total. It took African women not just as laborers, but as bodies, as wombs, as symbols of wealth and power, and it erased them so thoroughly that even their suffering was later denied or minimized. What it did to them was not simply enslavement. It was a slow, consuming destruction of self that many would have chosen death over if death had been offered. The capture of African women was not accidental or secondary. It was deliberate. Raiding parties moved through villages in East Africa, the Sahel, Central Africa, and the Horn, with precision honed over generations. Men were killed or restrained quickly. Resistance was crushed early because terror was efficient. Young women and girls were seized because they were the most valuable. Their age, their bodies, their perceived fertility determined their price long before they reached a market. Girls as young as 8 were taken because youth promised longer service and greater profit. Mothers were dragged away from children or forced to watch their daughters taken while they themselves were discarded as useless. The enslavers understood exactly what they were doing. They were not simply collecting workers, they were harvesting bodies for a system that thrived on sexual access, domestic labor, and reproductive control. From the moment of capture, African women entered a world where their womanhood became the justification for their suffering. The marches that followed were trials designed to break both body and spirit. Across the Sahara, across scrublands and coastlines, through heat that burned skin and nights that froze bone, women walked until their feet split open. Those who slowed were whipped. Those who collapsed were left to die, their bodies quickly swallowed by sand or brush. Water was rationed because mercy reduced profit. Women learned to drink sparingly, to swallow pain, to dissociate from hunger and fear. Rape during these marches was common and unpunished. A woman's body was already considered owned the moment she was captured. Pregnancy did not protect her, it marked her. Some gave birth on the trail and watched their newborns die within hours. Others were forced to keep walking while bleeding, carrying the memory of a child they could not bury. Survival did not mean safety. It only meant the suffering would continue longer. When African women reached slave markets in North Africa, Arabia, Persia, or the Indian Ocean world, the humiliation deepened. They were stripped naked and examined publicly. Teeth were inspected. Breasts were touched. Hips were measured. Virginity was checked with fingers that had no concern for pain or dignity. A woman's value rose if she appeared untouched, young, and compliant. It fell if she bore scars, showed fear too openly, or resisted inspection. Names were erased and replaced. Languages were forbidden. Hair was shaved to remove identity and beauty. The market was not simply a place of sale. It was a theater of dehumanization, where African women learned that their bodies no longer belonged to them in any sense, not even in memory. One of the most horrifying aspects of the Arab slave trade, and one of the least discussed, was how deeply gendered its violence was. While men were often enslaved for labor, women were enslaved for access. The system was built around sexual ownership. Enslaved African women, known as concubines or jawari, were legally available to their owners under prevailing interpretations of law at the time. Consent was irrelevant because enslaved women were not considered full persons with sexual autonomy. Rape was not recognized as rape when the victim was enslaved. Sexual violence was not an aberration. It was a feature of the system. African women were expected to submit, and their refusal was punished as defiance rather than protected as self-defense. Harems became one of the most infamous sites of this suffering, though popular imagination has romanticized them beyond recognition. For enslaved African women, the harem was not a place of luxury or intrigue. It was a prison of silk and silence. Women lived under constant surveillance, guarded often by eunuchs who were themselves victims of extreme violence. African boys were castrated to serve as guards, a procedure so brutal that many died from infection or blood loss. Those who survived became instruments of control, enforcing the system that had destroyed them. African women in harems were isolated from the outside world, from family, from any sense of future. They existed to be summoned, used, and dismissed. Pregnancy could bring temporary favor, but it also brought new vulnerability. A woman who bore a child could be discarded if the child died, or if her body no longer pleased her owner. The physical toll was devastating. Repeated sexual assault left women injured, infected, and traumatized. Childbirth without medical care claimed countless lives. Infants were often taken from mothers and raised separately or sold. Some women watched multiple children disappear from their arms, never knowing whether they lived or died. The psychological toll was equally severe. To survive, many women learned to detach from their own bodies, to exist somewhere else while being used. This dissociation was not weakness, it was survival, but it came at a cost. The longer slavery lasted, the harder it became to remember who they had been before capture. The system was designed to erase memory, to ensure that even if a woman lived, her identity did not. Death, in this context, could seem merciful. Death ended pain. Slavery prolonged it indefinitely. Many African women attempted suicide by refusing food, throwing themselves from heights, or walking into the sea when transport allowed. Others killed their own infants, acts later condemned as barbaric but born from unbearable love and despair. They knew what awaited their children if they lived. They had lived it themselves. To outsiders, these acts were incomprehensible. To the women who committed them, they were the last remaining form of control in a life where every other choice had been stolen. One reason the suffering of African women in the Arab slave trade has been minimized is the nature of historical record-keeping. Most written records were produced by enslavers, traders, or officials who had no interest in documenting cruelty that was normalized or profitable. Sexual violence rarely appeared in records because it was assumed, legal, and unremarkable to those in power. Women's voices were almost entirely absent. Unlike the Atlantic world, where large, visible plantations created communities that could later preserve memory and lineage, the Arab slave trade worked through absorption. African women were deliberately assimilated into households, pressured to abandon language and culture, and their descendants often lost all visible connection to Africa within a few generations. The system succeeded not only in exploiting them, but in erasing their presence from collective memory. This erasure allowed later generations to claim that the Arab slave trade was gentler, more humane, less brutal than its Atlantic counterpart. This claim collapses under scrutiny. Desert crossings had mortality rates comparable to or worse than ocean voyages. Castration rates were catastrophic. Sexual exploitation was systematic. Enslaved women had no legal protection against abuse. The absence of plantation fields does not indicate kindness. It indicates a different configuration of violence, one that unfolded behind walls, in bedrooms, and in silence. Brutality does not require chains to be devastating. Sometimes it is the intimacy of the violence that makes it harder to survive. African women also faced the unique pain of cultural and spiritual erasure. Forced conversion was common, and while some women found genuine faith later, many were compelled to abandon belief systems that had anchored their sense of self. Rituals, names, and ancestral connections were stripped away. Women who tried to preserve fragments of culture did so in secret, whispering songs to children, passing down memories in fragments small enough to escape punishment. These acts of quiet resistance mattered. They were fragile threads of humanity in a system designed to unravel everything. Despite everything, African women survived. Survival itself became an act of defiance. They formed bonds with one another when possible, sharing food, warning of danger, protecting the youngest among them. They learned how to navigate power, how to avoid the worst abuses when avoidance was possible, how to endure when it was not. Some gained manumission later in life, though freedom rarely brought restitution or reunion with family. Freedom often meant poverty, stigma, and isolation in societies that never fully accepted them as equals. Even then, they carried the weight of what had been done to them, memories that could not be erased, even when history tried to erase them. The long duration of the Arab slave trade compounds its tragedy. This was not a brief aberration, it was a central institution across centuries. It shaped economies, households, and social hierarchies. It normalized the sexual exploitation of African women to such an extent that questioning it seemed unnecessary to those who benefited. Abolition came slowly and unevenly, often under external pressure, and even then illegal trafficking persisted well into the 20th century. By the time it ended, countless lives had been consumed, and the silence surrounding them was already deeply entrenched. Today, the reluctance to confront this history fully stems from discomfort. It complicates narratives of innocence and guilt. It challenges romanticized visions of the past. It forces acknowledgement that African women's suffering was not incidental, but foundational to a global system of exploitation. Ignoring this history does not protect anyone's dignity. It perpetuates injustice by denying victims the recognition they were denied in life. To say that what the Arab slave trade did to African women was worse than death is not hyperbole. Death ends suffering. Slavery, as it existed for these women, extended suffering across years and decades, stripping away autonomy, identity, motherhood, and dignity piece by piece. Many lived long enough to watch everything that made life meaningful be taken from them. Their endurance was extraordinary, but endurance should not be mistaken for acceptance or resilience romanticized. They survived because they had no other option. Remembering them now is an act of restoration. It does not undo what was done, but it refuses the final victory of erasure. These women were not footnotes. They were not silent because they had nothing to say. They were silenced because their truth was inconvenient. To tell their story fully, without softening or denial, is to return to them a measure of humanity that history tried to steal. Their lives mattered, their suffering mattered, and memory, however late, is still a form of justice.